Good evening. My name is Uta Poiger, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Northeastern. And it's a pleasure to see many of you at this somewhat unusual time for our series, namely 5 p.m. Here tonight in order to engage in an important conversation, namely a conversation about how can a campus be a model community. This question came as something that the organizing committee for this series saw as important in multiple contexts, as you can imagine. As we were thinking about an event for early this semester towards the end of last year, we were of course all very much aware of the important student activism that is going on in this country. We are also of course very much aware of the big questions around race and justice that we are confronting. We are very much I think also informed, all of us, by the important claims to change that the Black Lives Matter movement is making. And at the same time, as Margaret Burnham just reminded us at the MLK commemoration that we had 2 days ago in this room, we are also in a moment of unprecedented Islamophobia. We are in a moment where we all are so aware how globally interconnected we are, and at the same time are in a moment of intense political and international strife as well. So it was in the context, these kinds of broad contexts, and there's many more of course, do impact what we do on campus. And at the same time, we are taking seriously something that President Aoun said to the community of Northeastern 3 years ago, namely that a campus cannot be, needs to be more than a microcosm of society, that a campus in fact needs to be a model for society. And so it is then that very question from 3 years ago that we are taking up today. As you know, our spring semester began with an urgent call to action from our president. He of course is doing that in the context also of important remarks and important policy changes or thought changes that many of you have been asking for and have been thinking about. So it's, for example, great to see that the student government is thinking together with leaders on this campus about what are the moments in the student's career here at Northeastern or in the student's path here at Northeastern when we need to really make sure that we talk about questions of diversity and inclusion. So again, all of these various contexts make me personally and the members of the organizing committee very interested and excited about the conversation that we are going to have tonight. You have all programs, so we won't be doing lengthy introductions of our speakers. What I would like to do right now is to call up Madeleine Estabrook, who's one of the co-organizers or the leader of one of the organizations that co-organizes this series. Namely, she's the Senior Vice President for Student Affairs. And it is really the College of Social Sciences and Humanities together with the Student Affairs and the School of Law that has been behind this series. And our moderator tonight, whom I'll introduce in a minute, of course, hails from the School of Law. Madeleine?
So this is very exciting, I think, for all of us. We've gathered this week to commemorate Dr. King's lessons, whether they be about justice or diversity or inclusion. And as Dean Poiger just pointed out, the President reminded us 3 years ago, but reminded us again at the beginning of this week, that as Northeastern is engaged in the world, we've got a duty to be a model, not a mirror of that world. So it should go without saying that we can't have learning that's engaged with the world without engaging with all peoples, with all ways of life, and that's why diversity has to be, must be so important to the essence of what our community is. Now, definitions of diversity are things that many of us have taken a lot of time to try to define or to try to agree on. The longest one that I can find is the one I'm going to read right now. Diversity is an inclusive mixture of our differences and similarities, represented by race, culture, color, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, age, sexual orientation, national origin, ancestry, genetics, religion, religious creed, disability status, veteran status, familial status, culture, language, communication, education, socioeconomic status, and other dimensions of life. Now, diversity is also about intergroup relations and our lived experiences with each other as neighbors and as citizens of the world. But to claim diversity and inclusion as core values at this university, to claim that as part of the planning process that we are all engaged in now with the academic plan and with the long-range plan, we must celebrate diversity in all of these forms, all of its forms. Foster a culture of respect that affirms the dignity of each person, strengthens our intergroup relations, and builds our community. So by experiencing the richness of cultural expression and engaging with those who bring different perspectives, that's how we truly develop the leaders and responsible global citizens that's at the mission of the work of this university. We can also and most definitely encourage the inquiry that's going to expand our own definition of community and continue to challenge us to continue to struggle with these difficult issues. This series of programs is one of the wonderful opportunities we have for these conversations. So by intentionally taking these times and opportunities to engage, to reflect, to be introspective, but most importantly to learn from and about one another, this is when we embrace diversity and inclusion. I thank you all for attending today, and many of you I've seen at other of these same series. Thank you for your participation, your attendance, and thank you for your ongoing commitment to this work.
Thank you, Madeleine. I think we have already heard a strong call to continue to challenge ourselves, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Margaret Burnham. Judge Burnham is a professor at the law school and is at the same time also the director of a very important project, the Civil Rights Restorative Justice Project, and she'll be guiding our session tonight. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean Poiger, and thank you, Vice President Estabrook. And Dean Poiger and Vice President Estabrook have really set the tone for this discussion. We want to leave as much space as possible so that we can talk among ourselves. That is to say, so that those of us who are up here can talk with you. And we also want it to be as fruitful and as concrete as we can. Diversity is a lifetime project for all of us, wherever, in whatever settings we are. And here at our university, the place where we work, it is as important as it is in every other aspect of our life. It's the challenge of, of this century and of the last century as well. And so it's not just a one-shot deal, and this isn't just a one-shot conversation. I will say that as a member of this community, I am particularly gratified that our president has decided to make this a core element of the long-range planning that is now going on, and that in response to the demonstrations across the country at the University of Missouri and elsewhere, the president did make the claim that for Northeastern, our challenge is to try in whatever ways we can to deepen our diversity. So you have the stated commitment from the leadership of our institution that this is on the table, and it's for us to ensure that that continues to be the commitment, but it's also for us to make some sense of that, to figure out, to operationalize it, as it were, to be pragmatic about it, to think about what it means for us as faculty, what it means for us as students, what it means to create a university that is welcoming to all of its citizens, where no one feels in any sense alienated, where everyone belongs and feels a sense of citizenship. None of that is easy. It doesn't come naturally, and we're certainly not there yet. So this would be the first of many conversations. I just want to start off by ticking off some points that I think are relevant to the larger question that President Aoun has put out there for us to consider, which is how a university can be a model for society rather than a microcosm of it, as Vice President Estabrook referred to a moment ago. And I think there are 6 areas where a university can concentrate its efforts and maximize its talents, its abilities, and its resources. The first is trying to figure out how to be a competent community. That is to say, a community that knows how to identify and solve its problems. And the second is to be a democratic community, a community in which everyone feels that they have a stake, that they have voice, that there's a community that is sufficiently non-hierarchical so that everyone has equal voice in the future and fate of that community. The third is to be a community that is resilient, that can recover from setbacks, that understands that crises are a part of life, and that nevertheless it can bounce back and take its and come back stronger, as it were. The fourth is a community that values diversity. And you've heard one definition of diversity. I'd also say that diversity involves not only continuing to maintain the strength and the ties that all of us have as members of particular communities, but also to bridge the various communities. So you're both enhancing those strengths and bridging among communities to create a kind of community that takes the most possible advantage of this question of diversity. Also, we want a community that values equity and social justice. And so how do you create, what is it that you have to do in order to bring those values to life in every aspect of a community's existence? I don't know if I ticked off 6, but I started with 6, but you get the gist. Those are some areas where I think, and so for today, what are we focusing on? We're focusing on this question of diversity, and of course all of these other sort of elements of what constitutes a healthy communities are related to diversity. And without diversity, and I think this is certainly the President's perspective, and it's ours to make it a reality, without diversity, then all of these other aspects of health in a community are going to suffer in one way or another. So with that, let me introduce our really absolutely stunningly fabulous panel. And I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. You do have, as Dean Poiger suggested, you have their bios, but we're particularly pleased to have speak first Dov Waxman, who is a professor here in political science and international affairs and Israel studies at Northeastern, and Statsky Professor of Jewish Historical and Cultural Studies. His most recent book, published in 2016, that's this year, I don't know whether you can get it from Amazon yet, he'll tell us, is Trouble in the Tribe, the American-Jewish Conflict over Israel. Professor Waxman knows a lot about one of the most conflicted areas on the globe at the moment, long-standing, deep-seated, seemingly intractable conflict, and he will help us draw some lessons from that. After Dov Waxman, Shaya Paku will speak from the perspective of our Social Justice Resource Center, where she is the program director and where she works to advance Northeastern's socio-political consciousness. Derek Lumpkins will follow Shaya. And Derek is the first director of the Neighborhood Partnerships and Programs here at Northeastern Crossing. He'll tell us all about Northeastern Crossing. It's a new endeavor here at the university. Obviously, diversity also includes the recognition of the reality that we as a university live in the middle of an African-American community, that's Roxbury. What does that mean for us? Derek will address some of those issues. Delia Cheung received her doctoral degree in education from our university, and she currently directs the Asian American Center, where her work focuses on supporting Asian American communities here at Northeastern and elsewhere. Professor Ellen Cushman is the Dean's Professor of Civic Sustainability, and she teaches English as well here at Northeastern, and she directs civic sustainability, diversity, and inclusion initiatives for the College of Social Sciences, and Humanities. So she will definitely be an important voice as we move forward on these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Burnham. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dean Poiger and the organising committee for putting together this programme on this important topic, and also for the whole series of events that I think really are very timely and crucially important. Now, I've been told I have only to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, which is an impossibility as a professor who likes to go on and on. So I'm going to try and be very, very brief in my remarks. I want to begin, since I am an academic, with a definition, because that's what we must do. I want to begin by defining what I think of as the attributes of a model community, and then talk a little bit about the challenges to that, and I'm going to make specific reference to my own area of focus, which is the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So from my definition of a model community, I draw upon the work of a German sociologist and philosopher called Jürgen Habermas. And he has really provided the ideal definition of what a model community or what a model political community looks like. And it's one in which all individuals have an equal opportunity to participate, are free of any coercion, and able to speak their honest opinions in a collective search for understanding and truth. So according to Habermas, quote, every subject with the competence to speak is allowed to take part in discourse. Everyone is allowed to question any assertion whatsoever. Everyone is allowed to introduce any assertion whatsoever, and everyone is allowed to express his or her attitudes, desires, and needs. This egalitarian interaction cultivates, according to Habermas, a sense of solidarity among its participants and promotes mutual understanding. In attempting to present our views to others, and we are called upon to articulate our views in a clear manner, and we begin to see ourselves from the other's point of view, and thus, at least potentially, able to be more critical and self-aware about our own opinions. That encapsulates what, for me, is a model community and what a campus community can be. And I think underlying that are what I would identify as 3 kind of core values or principles: inclusivity, tolerance, and critical inquiry. And I think that's the goal, but I think the challenge that we face here is how do we promote a community based upon inclusivity, tolerance, and critical inquiry when we're embedded in a wider context in which those 3 values are, to put it mildly, widely challenged. So we live in a country, in a society, in a world where there is little inclusivity. Rather, there's a great deal of exclusion along multiple lines. So how can we fashion an alternative kind of community that is inclusive along multiple lines? How can we promote tolerance when we live in a society which is, if not increasingly intolerant, then at least highly intolerant of other opinions? And finally, how can we sustain the value of critical inquiry when increasingly we live not only in communities that are often exclusionary, but in communities in which there isn't respect for critical inquiry? That rather than really seeking to understand each other, we're much more engaged in trying to attack each other and trying to simply kind of reinforce or support our side of the issue. And I think this is particularly apparent in speaking from my own perspective on the issue of Israel and Palestine. Because in the wider society in which we live, the discussion around this very controversial subject is one that's often exclusionary. It's one that seeks to exclude certain positions, certain perspectives, certain voices. It's also a discussion which is highly intolerant. It's highly intolerant of other people's opinions or other people's experiences or alternative narratives. And it's one not based upon critical inquiry, but one based upon advocacy and attack. So the goal is not to understand each other, but rather to try and advocate for your side or another. And I think in the face of that, it's very difficult to fashion an alternative kind of community around that particular issue. I think the goal here is to, as President Aoun says, not to simply reflect that wider society. Now, how can we, on this issue and many others, create a society that resists those external pressures? Do we need to enclose ourselves? Do we need to put up a kind of shield to prevent those pressures from spilling over into our community? I don't have the answer to that. My belief, my conviction is that if we can strive to create a community based upon critical inquiry, tolerance, and inclusivity, then ultimately that can hold up a mirror to this wider society. I seek to do that on the issue of Israel-Palestine. It's a challenge. I think there are many other issues where the same is true, and I think we have to be very aware today that there are a lot of forces outside of our specific community that are trying to undermine that particular mission. So I'm out of time there. I'm hoping to look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shea Gregory Poku, and I'm honored to be here today. As an African-American woman, I can never forget that my space on this stage is a direct result of people who bravely challenged conventional norms of what was acceptable, right, or desirable. Women were not admitted to Northeastern University's day college until 1943. I am a part of this arc of history. And that is a reason why I love working at the Social Justice Resource Center here at Northeastern University, where we work to equip and inspire students to take action on their own unique vision of social change. My personal story of change making began when I was a junior in college. I studied abroad in South Africa. I found out quite a few of my other girlfriends in college studied too, although not with me. We collectively lamented that many of the official brochures that we pored over and the advising sessions we attended didn't mention the things that we were most concerned about as students of color. For example, I was heading to South Africa, a country notorious for its treatment of people who looked just like me, and no one mentioned it. So when I got back to campus, it occurred to me I should host a panel called The Black Experience of Study Abroad to help fill in those informational gaps. The director of our international education department was enthusiastic about the idea, and she supported me every step of the way. The next semester, my small women liberal arts college yielded its highest number of Black students studying abroad in its history, many who were inspired hearing our personal stories. That experience was transformative for me. I was able to channel my concerns and my voice into a productive contribution to my campus. To this day, my undergraduate institution still holds that panel. I share this story because a model community to me is one where students, staff, faculty, and administrators feel like they can contribute their ideas and their talents to strengthen the institution. And I say this because the most dangerous thing that threatens any college and its inclusivity is silence. When I speak of silence, I'm speaking about the trans student who came out to me just last week, but doesn't feel that he can live his truth on our campus. When I speak of silence, I'm speaking about the brilliant Latina student I know who is distracted by the microaggressions in her classroom to the point where she cannot focus on what the professor is saying. And when I speak of silence, I'm speaking of the young, working-class white woman who works with me and confided in me that she's afraid of saying anything about race or class for fear she'll be labeled a racist. These are stories of real Northeastern students whose pain is largely experienced in silence. Northeastern is forward-thinking. We're adapting the higher educational model to the needs of an increasingly complex, information-based economy. But the danger of silence is that we may not be sufficiently attuned to the way that social inequity scars the lives of our community and admires their ability to contribute their very best to our campus. To me, silence is cultural violence. When I mention cultural violence, I'm influenced by the work of the Norwegian peace researcher Johan Galtung. He parsed apart violence as three interacting forces: structural, cultural, and physical. Structural violence is injustice and exploitation built into a social system. Cultural violence is the prevailing attitudes and beliefs that justify and legitimize the structural violence. And direct violence is physical: murder, war, rape, assault. To me, tackling cultural violence on this campus means disrupting traditional narratives of whose voices and whose experiences matters. That's why I was so proud in October 2014. The Center for the Arts, they brought in artist in residence Tatiana Falazadeh to campus. And a wide swath of actors across campus hosted Northeastern Stands Together Against Street Harassment block party. That was awesome. And I was proud on April 23, 2015, when Northeastern honored our snow removal team during the academic honors convocation, and they received a standing ovation. Both of these examples represent the true Northeastern I know and love, where we could collaboratively ensure that everyone's voice has a space to be recognized and that no one's experience is ignored. That's also why I applaud our Torch Scholars program, where we acknowledge and address the unique contextual barriers that exist for first-generation college students. The Torch program is one way that Northeastern actively responds to structural violence in our society. But I believe we can do more to provide equal access to the best that Northeastern has to offer. If co-op is our university's brand distinctive, can we create partnerships so that each and every Northeastern student has access to the snazzy business attire they need for their co-op interviews, so they can all dress the part? Our opportunities as an institution are only as valuable as they are accessible. Secondly, to address structural violence, we absolutely must make sure that we continue to create space where constructive dissent is welcomed and is used to improve Northeastern's overall experience. My director of international education could have been very offended that I wanted to host this program. She was really doing a great job running her office, and we remained close friends. But instead, she guided me and supported me in creating a program that met the needs of an underserved student population and benefited the entire campus in the process. We cannot be for innovation and averse to social disruption. I believe that student activism is a form of leadership and civic engagement. Like all forms of student leadership, activists need coaching, mentorship, and support, and sometimes, yes, even sanctions to help them grow as leaders. But we do not want these sanctions to become repudiations, because there are real benefits from activism. Personally, I'm grateful that we have the Curry Student Center and this ballroom that we're sitting in right now, because students signed petitions advocating for a student space and taxed themselves to raise money for its construction. As a model community, we should be creating multiple platforms for students to help weigh in on the direction of our campus. That is why ideas like the Social Impact Council are valuable, as was the Provost's recent town hall meeting and other efforts that encourage campus-wide discussions about our academic planning process. We have all celebrated Dr. King this week. He famously said that life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are we doing for others? Our students at Northeastern care about this question. They benefit from our mission to create and translate knowledge to meet global and societal needs. And they benefit from our rich culture of social entrepreneurship and social innovation. We should be at the forefront of ensuring that our students' fervor to create change does not drown out the voices and contributions of the very people they are working to assist. As a model community, we have to ask ourselves if we are preparing our students to lead and to listen. I say this in closing because so much of the self-actualized woman that I am today is because Dr. Jennifer Lund, a lone woman in my college, listened to me when I said that the Black experience of study abroad was important. She not just helped me find my place on campus, but helped me discover my unique voice, and she birthed a change maker.
Good evening, everyone. So when I was first asked to do this panel, and the topic being model communities, one of the things that my mind very quickly went to was the idea of networks and the power of networks in a community. And when I think about networks, I think about the intentional connections between multiple people or multiple organizations around a common set of goals or problems versus networking, where we all kind of do that every so often. One-on-one, we'll go out, we'll meet a variety of people, but it's not necessarily to address a specific goal or a specific problem. And so when I was thinking about networks, I drew upon my experience with the Roxbury Cultural Network when I was the executive director of Discover Roxbury. So I've only been at Northeastern for about 7 months, and prior to that I worked at Discover Roxbury for 7 years. And during that time, we were a member of the Roxbury Cultural Network, which for us was diverse, not quite as diverse as that definition that we heard earlier, but it did include our arts organization, a museum, historic properties, a historic preservation group, park advocates, and 2 community development corporations. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of what the different organizations did. And we were gathered to address the common issues around countering the negative stereotypes of Roxbury, countering the negative narratives, the negative perceptions of Roxbury, which have held that neighborhood back in terms of investment and opportunities for both the people and for the neighborhood as a whole. And what made this network so powerful and so useful was one, there was a convener. Generally, Discover Roxbury convened the network, but there was no real leader. We were all sort of bought in, and we developed the decisions and the ground rules collectively. Information and communication was also democratized because we all spoke to each other as equals, despite the different sizes that we were. Some organizations only had a staff of 1, others had a staff of 20. But we still talked to each other as peers and as partners and as collaborators versus as having these different hierarchies and determining which way the network would go based upon the size of the organization. Because we were working collectively, our voices and our vision were amplified. And so instead of just one person saying this is how we needed to move forward or another organization saying we had to move forward this way, collectively we worked together to move our agenda forward and to get our voices heard in the city. And because it was a network versus a formal organization, there was an inherent flexibility of that network as well. So members had the freedom to sort of engage or withdraw as they needed to and as their capacity allowed. And because of that, there was also an inherent vibrancy and dynamicism to the network that allowed us to really engage each other in different ways and to engage our surrounding community as well. And so there was a greater sense of ownership and a greater sense of possibility amongst all the members of that network. And as a result, we felt like we really had an opportunity to really move the agenda forward in the city of Boston. And most of that was because of the scale we were able to achieve, again, not because we were working as one organization or just a couple, but as an engaged network that really worked together and really tried to push an agenda forward. Now, one other network so networks can be very visible. It can also be these invisible networks that exist in the city and that exist all around us. And I don't know how many of you saw today's Boston Globe article about arts organizations and the lack of funding. But I think one of the pieces that article misses is the fact that there are networks that exist out there. So, for example, Stage Source is a network of theater organizations. And there's also the Boston Dance Alliance, there's the Boston Cultural Change Network. There are many networks that exist in the city that are invisible but still hold the organizations and hold the city together in ways in which people don't realize and people don't understand. And I think that was one of the things, a very important piece that article missed. So when I think about networks and I think about the campus being a model community, my impression, and again, I've only been here 7 months, but my impression is that rather than there being a strong sense of networks or a variety of networks on campus, I sort of noticed more of a hub and spoke system, or multiple hubs with multiple spokes, where information is sort of channeled into that hub system and then sort of disseminated out. And it has its pros. It's a very efficient system for coordinating lots of people into a particular direction. But on the other hand, the con is that it's not very organic. There's not as much of a vibrant feeling, and information isn't as readily available about everyone because not everybody's information is gathered or it's not always disseminated. So when I think about Northeastern Crossing and its role here on the campus, my staff and I see ourselves as being a portal for building new networks and new collaborations, both between the university and between the university and folks off campus, but also within the university itself. So I can already see just within this this audience here. There are a variety of staff and faculty who I've met, also on the stage, staff and faculty that I've met, that I'm working with, that I've networked with, that I would like to see build and help support some of the networks that are in progress and that can continue to develop the campus network as well. I would love to see Northeastern Crossing assist sort of some of the STEM organizations and the STEM departments go from STEM to STEAM as we work with some of the arts organizations and arts departments on campus as well as off campus. And I know there are a lot of off-campus groups that are working on STEAM, and they would love to work with some of the STEM programs here. And when I think about innovation, because I've also met with some of the innovation teams as well, just yesterday I met with the director of the creative economy industry for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and she would love to work with Northeastern University and the innovation community here. So there's lots of opportunities for networks, for strengthening networks, for building new networks as well. And I really believe in the power of networks in terms of changing the dynamics here on campus and generally. Thanks.
Good evening. I'm really honored to be here, and I think what's most important about this is that it is a conversation. Conversations, I believe they should go on and on and on, so I really hope that this is the beginning of a really important conversation. My name is Delia Cheung. I am a third-generation Chinese American. I am a feminist, and I am a mother. And I think, based on all of those identities, I think about the communities that I'm a part of on a daily basis, and I'm often also forced to think about the communities that I am not a part of. For me, I think the most important characteristic of a model community is that all members of that community feel a sense of belonging. Dr. Terrell Strayhorn is a professor of higher education at The Ohio State University and the director of the Center for Higher Education Enterprise, and he defines sense of belonging. He's done a lot of research on sense of belonging and its impact for college students. His definition of sense of belonging states that sense of belonging is students' sense of social support on campus, a feeling of connectedness, and that one is important to others. When I was a college student, I was, like some of you in this room, one of those hyper-involved student leaders. I was really involved with our Alana Center on campus. I was a student leader within our Asian American community, and I was really connected with our student of color population on campus. That was my place. That was where I felt my sense of belonging. But I made the conscious decision to become involved in the broader campus community by running for a position on our student government's executive board. And like a lot of institutions, our student government was predominantly white, cisgender, straight male. And to my surprise, I ran for this position and I won. And I think in my head, I thought that because I had, been elected, by my peers, that this meant that I was a valuable part, of our campus community. Fast forward later on in the year, and, there were some incidents on campus, and racial tensions on our campus were really high. And at that moment, I really felt invisible in the context of our student government. Even though I was there, I was part of the executive board of this organization. And so during one student government meeting, I marked myself as present for the meeting, and then I walked outside and I sat in the hallway. And I was sitting there, waiting. I was hoping for someone to notice my absence, to come look for me, to say, "Where's Delia?" And I sat in the hallway for the entire meeting of the student government. And at that moment, I felt completely unimportant to everyone. I felt invisible. And I felt like I was not part of our campus community. I think that our actions as a community have to be intentional. I think inclusivity is not a state of being. I think inclusivity is an action. I think it's something that needs to be practiced, it needs to be reflected on, and it needs to be continued to work on. I grew up for 45 minutes outside of Boston, and when I grew up in my town, it was not diverse. In my fourth grade, there were 2 students of color, me and David Chen. With all of the best intentions, our fourth grade curriculum included a unit on China. And in part of this unit, our class was led by our white teacher to reenact some of the traditions associated with the Lunar New Year. And my teacher called on me and David Chen to be acting as the role of grandparents. And if you look at me and David, you would think that we had similar backgrounds, but when you look at us, there's so much you can't tell about our stories, right? You can't look at me and know that I was born and raised in Massachusetts, that my parents were born and raised in New York City, that my family has been in this country for over 100 years. And so what followed was a series of traditions, and I had no idea what they were. I was not familiar with them. These were not things that we did in my house, in my family, and in not knowing these things, I felt like I was this puppet, in front of my friends. I felt like I was an imposter. I felt like a fake Chinese person. And so what had started out as, intention, to include diverse perspectives in our curriculum really had the opposite effect. I felt completely disconnected, from my classroom and from my peers, and I felt invisible again. And for me, this has really been, the hallmark of my experiences as an Asian American woman. I never really feel like I fit in as an American, and at the same time, I don't think I fit in within the context of a Chinese community. So this has been, my ongoing struggle. How do I find my place? How do I find my home? And I think at times, this can be a really isolating search to be a part of. In the face of all of this, I think there was one thing that saved me. It sounds trite, but it's true, books. I devoured all the books that spoke to me. They gave me an intellectual space where I felt like I could belong, and that explained my existence here. I dove into Ronald Dukakis, and I learned about the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I started to understand the ways that history had affected my own family's journey and path to the United States. This process of learning about my own history was paralleled with a simultaneous unlearning. We talk about promoting diversity within the context of a community, and we talk about learning from different people, from their different experiences and perspectives. And I think it's really important to think about at the same time how we have to unlearn. In my own experience, as I read A Different Mirror and Strangers from a Different Shore, these things helped me unlearn what I thought I knew about American history. I thought American history was about the American Revolution and the 13 colonies, but those stories never included the stories of people that look like me. By unlearning all of this as the sole story of American history, this was where I found, my place to have my voice. And I think these can be really challenging questions to ask. I think to wrestle with this epistemological question, how do we know what we know? I think it's really challenging. And I think this can get glossed over. When we talk about diversity, I think we get really stuck, in talking about structural diversity. On the face of things, how diverse is our community? But I think we don't get to asking, what does this mean? And how do the members of our community actually feel? In my own experience as a college student, I became empowered because I was able to create spaces where we could have conversations about power and privilege within our own campus community. These were painful conversations to have, but I think what it did was it gave students a space to make their voices heard. When we reached a critical mass and enough students were concerned, we were able to have a campus-wide community where we could share our experiences and dive into this together. And I think this worked because we had built up effective coalitions across, all of our smaller communities. Finding ways for the Asian Americans to connect with the African American students on campus, with the Latino students, with our LGBT community. And I think that was really great. But at the same time, I would never call that community a model community because I'm not really sure what that looks like. I think this is really an aspirational thing that we're all always trying to get to. And so I think, when I think about what a model community is, I think it is about continuing to work. I think it means continuing to work on having a broader conversation to include more voices, to work on building opportunities for students to connect and to feel valued, and to work on asking the hard questions about when are we failing the least visible members of our community. And I want to wrap up by sharing some words from spoken word poet Bo Sia. And he says, "Listen, we uphold institutions even at the cost of people. Listen, there's more to discover in the depths than in the volume." Thank you.
Osiyo nagada. Solo dawadoa chalagi. Chichalagi ageya. Ayaya ye didiyo harski. Aya galielika. Ahani usahi. Wado, Massachusetts, Alewapanog, ani yawi. Hello, everyone. Saloli is my name, and I'm a Cherokee woman, and I'm a teacher. I'm glad to be here with you all tonight, and I'd like to recognize and thank especially the Massachusetts and Wampanoag peoples on whose land we stand tonight. I begin most of my talks in Cherokee for a few reasons that help us work toward a sense of shared communities. First, speaking Cherokee signals my difference that may not be otherwise visible, especially if the diversity of a space is judged using a superficial read of people in it. Cherokee is also a way to locate myself with my peoples who are not present in this place and this moment, but who are a part of my thinking and my work. Finally, I gave thanks to the peoples whose land this was originally to call forth the history of empire implicating each of us here tonight. By listening to this story of why I introduced myself in Cherokee, you've begun to appreciate a different language that you may not get to hear regularly. You've begun to understand something about my character and what I do for a living. You've learned something of the peoples on whose land this university and this great city of Boston was built. Listening is a key aspect of creating communities, but it's often seen as the least important of the language arts, somewhere behind reading, writing, and speaking. Colleagues in my field have written a great number of articles on rhetorical listening, it's called, but here I'm speaking more to what that listening can do for creating an inclusive community. Listening is an act of engaging, understanding, and appreciating. It's a taking in and integrating of what another person has said into your pre-existing understandings, and offering back in what you've understood and heard, sometimes with a raised hand or nod or eye contact or taking pictures or notes. Listening is a very active engagement with another person. It creates with that person a third shared space of understanding. Listening to each other is central to creating communities because it enacts a social contract implicit in the stories that we share. Cherokees have more than a dozen words for story. Each one reveals how storying creates knowledge and how listening and storying are both social responsibilities that we have for each other. You may notice that all of the words with them carry with them a sense of the shared social obligation creating with and from storying. The reciprocity involved in storying is central for creating communities. When someone shares a story with you, it's a gift that carries with it a lasting obligation to hold on to pick up and let go again if asked to do so, to bear witness, to carry forward that understanding. Offering these words to you in Cherokee within our writing system ask you now to carry forward this understanding of at least one American Indian language that's persevering in a land where English only is the rule of law in many states. Please raise your hand if this is the first time that you've heard the Cherokee language spoken. Thank you very much. And please raise your hand if this is the first time you've seen Cherokee written. A few more of you. Thank you so very much for doing that. I appreciate that. The 85-character Cherokee syllabary was introduced formally to the tribe in 1821 by a Cherokee man named Sequoyah. By most accounts, it was learned by our peoples within the span of 5 years without print or mass education across 700 miles of territory. With this writing system, the Cherokee were understood to be literate peoples in a time when most tribes were considered to be savages. By the late 1820s, the New Testament had been translated into Cherokee along with our nation's constitution and laws. We had our own printing press, and we were actively taking a stand to protect our lands in the United States federal courts. Anglo-European settlers saw the Cherokee as one of the 5 civilized tribes because of what this writing system helped our people codify. It's still in use today as a key component of our language perseverance efforts. Languages matter to the identities and cultures of people who use them. Appreciating and learning about, and in many languages and symbolic systems, allows us to create communities in which English is not the only or primary language that can or should be used and understood. In saying this, one of my goals has been to respectfully challenge understandings, leading us to reconsider what we know or what we thought we knew. A respectful challenge recognizes that identifying ignorance is a key part of learning. If we begin with what we don't know and earnestly engage with each other with humility and without shame, we respectfully challenge ourselves to grow and help each other in that growth. In Cherokee, the word for teacher, ski, and the word for student, ski. differ only slightly. They're often understood as two sides of the same coin. In our communities, we are all teachers and all learners who respectfully challenge each other to redress ignorance, to deepen understandings of each other, and to share stories. To recap, I've listed for you a few of the methods by which we begin to create inclusive stories, and I've linked to many of the talks beforehand, which I'm really pleased that we have so well coordinated together. We've talked about listening. We've talked about understanding the social obligation of storying. We've together addressed our ignorance and talked about the importance of admitting our ignorance with respect and challenging each other to learn through critical inquiry. We've talked about networks and how we build them together through the sharing of stories and the understanding and listening to stories. And we've begun to challenge the monolinguistic assumption in U.S. universities to create room for multilingual communities and peoples. These indigenous methods and other methods of building diverse and inclusive communities and everyday interactions help us to create a culture of inclusion at Northeastern. We've begun to do the larger work of revising paradigms of thought. In short, we've begun to decolonize the university to create a pluralversity of diverse and inclusive communities. Wadon.
We can engage as a fuller audience with what the panel has left us with, which is an incredibly rich array of ideas about diversity and about how we can understand both the processes as well as the goals that we might set for ourselves in trying to deepen diversity within our own community. And I want to, point out just from my perspective, I understand Dove to be asking us whether it's realistic to think about building a model community in a world which is as complex and as interactive as it is, whether that requires some kind of a sealing off and an insularity that is really not, does not further our broader purposes, goals, and values. I particularly liked Shayla's ideas about silencing and about when we know who we're silencing and what we can do as a community to make sure that everyone has voice and to recognize that silencing always takes place and what we can do to minimize that. And Derek, I particularly appreciate your view that perhaps there are models of governance and administration that may stand in the way of our efforts to deepen diversity in our communities, and that there are organizational approaches that have emerged really recently within the last 20 years that are non-hierarchical, that look more like networking and less like the spoken wheel hierarchical structures with which many of us are familiar, and the need to sort of break out of that mode, even in a large and complicated university like this one, in order to give voice to people who might otherwise not be participants. Well, how do we know what it is we do know? This broad epistemological question that you, Delia, have put to us that really challenges us to think about what we're actually teaching in our classes to our students. And Ellen, too, is really, Ellen's reflection is really also about what's absent from our classes, so that when we talk about diversity, we're not just talking about a transforming, what we look like as a faculty, as a staff, as a student body, but we're also talking about what it is that's going on within our classrooms, within our spaces of learning that help us understand the world, the world that all of us operate in or should be operating in, and so that that was incredibly. Both bold and telling lesson about the Cherokee language, and it was quite quite informative to see how many hands, I don't think there were any hands that weren't raised in response to Ellen's challenge to us. So now I will open it up, and I'll ask you to tell us who you are, and then to give us a question, not a statement, but a question. There can be a little statement before the question, but there must be a question mark at the end of whatever it is you say, and direct it to anyone in our panel. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Riccio, the director of the Social Impact Lab. And I do have to start with a statement, which is that I just want to thank you all for your honesty and say how proud and inspired I am to be able to call you my colleagues here at Northeastern. I think we've got an amazing community. I wanted to ask you to think about what is the relationship between thinking about building a model community here on campus and how we see our ethical responsibility as a university that prides ourselves on experiential learning that often sends our students into other people's communities. And how can we think about preparing them for their ethical responsibilities to practice these behaviors of listening and respect and humility, and also give them the intellectual frameworks to understand the complexity of doing that? Because I think they're really related, but do you see what can link them together?
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Rebecca, if you don't mind. I'm not seeing anybody else grab their microphone, so I think I'll just jump in. And
Ellen, go for it.
I will do so, thank you. With great gusto, I hope. Rebecca, thank you so much for your kind words and to begin with. And the very thoughtful question, I very much appreciate that. And I also add, I very much appreciate all of you who were so very courageous to admit your ignorance. And I want to go back to that point to answer your question. When you raised your hand, do you realize how very brave you were to say, I don't know this, and this is something I want to know? And that, I think, is one of the very first steps that we can begin to do when we begin to understand our own strengths and the places where we can grow, and then how it is that we can begin to engage somebody else in the teaching and learning that we need to be able to grow. For me, modeling that with my students and all of the complexity of working with communities and building networks and building relationships and thinking about responsibility and reciprocity and thinking about the critical inquiry that comes with this and all of the methods that we have outlined here, the making visible, the sharing of stories, the honoring of our elders and our teachers, which you did so beautifully, and all of the ways in which we have these pieces or methods or ways that can help us begin to build those connections. But it all begins with us and understanding what it is that we don't know and what it is that we need to know, and embracing that, not as a limitation, but as a place of strength for moving forward.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Boyarsky. I'm a student here at Northeastern. One thing that I think that often happens when we're having discussions is we recall on our own stories, what's happened to us in the past. But this can often lead to this notion of confirmation bias, which is the reality we think exists is the one that is real. But unfortunately, that's often not true. In reality, the world that we think exists is often a very skewed view of the world. So what are you actively doing to fight confirmation bias and try to, ignore what your personal stories are and focus on everyone is experiencing?
Great question. Terrific question.
I will start. I think, a lot of this goes back to Ellen was talking about in terms of thinking about what does it mean to truly listen. And I really appreciated this idea of a third collective space, when two people are listening to each other, because I think it's really, really hard to actually listen to someone. I think that is something that everyone needs to continue to practice and work on. And I think when you are able to really truly listen and hear another person for their own experiences and perspectives, that's when you're able to get to a little bit more understanding. But this is an ongoing process that we are all continually engaged in, so I think that
that's where I would start my answer to your question, but that's a great question.
And just adding on to that response, to both of the questions actually, I think part of what needs to happen is people just asking a question to start a conversation, instead of just saying from the bat, right off the bat, this is what I believe. I think sometimes people just need to ask the question, what do you know? Have you heard of? Are you aware of? Just to get a sense of what the common starting points are, because you never know how far or how close you are to someone else in terms of perspective or experience or some other situation. And by starting a conversation with a question, you get to know where that starting point is, where their perspectives begin, where your perspectives end, to know where to begin that conversation, begin that, finding that common ground.
I would add, I think, and this also goes back to Rebecca's question, which I also really appreciate, which is how we conceptualize the problem, right? And so I think as a university, it's really important that we have these complicated conversations in our classroom. And I'll give you a specific example. In terms of standing at our students and thinking about confirmation bias, we could talk a lot about violence, right? And violence particularly in Africa, which I'm only mentioning because I've spent a lot of time in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And so if we're not teaching our students that who we are as people in terms of our purchasing decisions, in terms of our policy making and everything else, are closely linked to how violence continues to be perpetuated in these societies, if we're not teaching them histories of colonialism, and if we're not teaching our students, for example, that there are more women who were killed by domestic and intimate partner violence last year than were killed in terms of the war of Iraq, how we're conceptualizing the problems that people need to be even talking about when these conversations and learning to listen will be kind of a fallacy.
So it's a great question, and certainly a very challenging one. I think increasingly we live in communities that allow that foster confirmation bias, right? Whether it's our friends on Facebook, whether it's the media that we read, etc. And I think that actually contributes to our inability to engage in critical inquiry and to be increasingly intolerant toward each other, because we are able to now live in increasingly narrow communities of choice intellectually as well. For myself, I think I try to resist that partly, I speak particularly on the issue that I work on most, which is Israel-Palestine, by exposing myself to multiple viewpoints and perspectives. Even every day I get it's very dissonant experience actually, because on this issue it's almost alternate realities that you're constantly reading about. But that's one way. And the other way is to ensure that I'm meeting and hearing, and indeed on this campus, inviting speakers with multiple perspectives. So students and myself included are being challenged by hearing different perspectives and different viewpoints. And then finally, I think it's by constantly being aware of the tendency to reinforce my own positions and not allowing oneself the intellectual complacency to think that, well, this is what I think now, I've arrived at a particular position and I'm not willing to change it. And I think that's a question of upholding one's own intellectual integrity and moral integrity, ultimately, and that's the kind of commitment, and I hope I try and do that, I try and model that, and I think that's what we're trying to cultivate here in this community.
And can I add just one thing really quickly to that as well? I would also say that another important part of dealing with confirmation bias is actually understanding your own story. I think a lot of people understand their opinions, but they don't actually understand or interrogate how they came to the conclusions that they came to based on the same information. And so really being intentional about understanding how you came to those conclusions and those inferences is also really important.
Great. Terrific.
Hi. Did you? Sorry, I'm shorter. My name is Christian Snow, and I'm a 1L at the law school. I want to thank you guys for being here and having this conversation. I think it's amazing to have these conversations, and coming from working and doing community building, it's something that I have been missing. My question is, how do you get students to not see these conversations as a distraction or as something separate from their education? This has been my personal experience in the law school, is that when students who want to bring these conversations to the table come up, they are constantly seen as distractions and reported as such. And I'm not sure if that exists in the rest of the school. I went to a small liberal arts school, and I know that that happened there as well. It was the same kind of sentiment. So my question is, how do you, one, get students to see it as part of their education, but then how do you, two, equip professors to speak on these issues and guide the conversation? Because I think some of it is that both parties are ill-equipped. Thank you.
Say a little bit more about, is there a specific experience that you're speaking to? Or
Sure.
say a little bit more about what it is you're driving at.
Yeah, so for instance, in the law, you will find a lot of history. And at first I thought it was because I was coming from a historical education background that I was nitpicking at the things that were kind of washed over or given as narratives. And so I would speak up and say, I think that you're delivering a narrative that I think we should probably question. For one pure instance, the concept of American values, and that maybe we need to unpackage that just a little bit because all of us are not coming from the same America, and I just need an understanding of what your premises are to get where I need to apply this and go forward. And it wasn't so much spoken in the classroom that was a distraction, but later students would come and say, I can't learn because someone's constantly bringing up race. It's not always relevant. I cannot learn because someone's constantly bringing up class. It's not relevant. The law is separate from this. And so last semester, it was like a constant theme that I was trying to figure out why I was having this discourse, because I feel like it's important to my education to not only speak up on it, but to hear it from other people and their perspectives. I only have one, and so I want to see where other people are chiming in, and it's a part of my understanding of this new material and digesting it. But it wasn't seemed as so. And in speaking to professors about it, it was also this uncomfortability of even diving into the topic. And the situations being mishandled in the classroom to add on to that frustration. So it's just a little bit, I feel like on both sides, either it's not important and we need to move on from it, or it is important and we need to teach each other how to listen and talk about these things.
I'll just speak to that as a professor in this. I think it's really important. So I teach about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the very first class we talk about narratives, and we talk about how our own backgrounds and experiences might shape our approach, and we talk about bias. And I think it's important, and that's also about signaling to students that this is important, so it's something that happens in the classroom and is sufficiently important to dedicate class time to. So I think that's part of the educational mission, is expanding students' understanding of what the purpose, what we're trying to do. It's not just about going mechanically through what's on the syllabus. It's about developing a much more critical self-awareness. That's what we're here to do. So I think a very narrow conception of education as just going through exams, as well as an excessive focus on careerism. I think those two things can stand in the way of that, and I think we have to push back against that.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank you, for that question and for sharing your experiences, because I know those things, it's a painful experience, right, to feel like you're not valued or validated in the classroom, and these are things that many people are living, every day, on this campus. I think from my own perspective, working at Northeastern and within student affairs, and so engaging students outside of the classroom, I think for me, I feel like I observe within our students, this sort of disconnect, where, they have two sort of Northeastern experiences, right? One is their Northeastern experience in the classroom that's related to their major and their co-op, and then the other Northeastern experience is, everything that happens outside of the classroom. And I think, as Dove sort of alluded to, I think we need to figure out a way to reconcile those two experiences more, but, it's really challenging because, all of the outcomes of college, seem to be focused, on the classroom and on co-op and on getting a job, but how do we do more to bring in these conversations and explain and help everyone understand, how all of these things are relevant in, preparing students to be out in the workforce, to be members of, these diverse communities. I think all of that needs to be worked on both sides. So thank you for sharing your experience.
And I also just want to add that what you brought up is not new. When I was in college, we were going through very similar things of being otherized and being silenced and being told, we shouldn't talk about these things. It's nothing new. I mean, I went to college 20 years ago, and so we were talking about those things then. I think the vocabulary around which we talk about these things has changed. I mean, we didn't talk about white privilege before because it wasn't a term that had been coined back then. And now we have these new terms that are coined, and we can actually have these conversations, these difficult conversations, because we have the vocabulary to discuss it. And I think it's important to discuss it, and I would encourage you to continue pushing these difficult conversations in class, and even outside of class in the dorms, to continue pushing yourself and pushing your peers to acknowledge that these are critical issues, that they are important, and that they're topical. And for those who don't discuss it, they're missing out. You're the one who's getting that education. You're the one who's testing yourself. You're the one who will be more prepared going forward because you are actually addressing these issues, and you're doing so in a very concise and precise way.
I think it's also important, again, to stand in the other person's shoes so that to have a full understanding of what it is you feel is missing, or what you feel is missing from that classroom, but also to stand in the shoes of the individual who's thinking, I should really be learning property now. Property has really nothing to do with what's going on in the outside world around race. And so just sort of understanding what perspective that person is bringing into the classroom, I think, is really just important, because this is working at a number of levels. It's working between the students, among the students. It's working between the students and the faculty, and then it's working inside the classroom, a number of levels in a number of venues. It's working in the classroom and outside of the classroom. So it creates a kind of what could be a very creative and productive complexity where you could actually really push some conversations forward. Brooke Baker.
Again, thank you to everyone who spoke. I wanted to say that I actually have heard Cherokee language before, and I have some good friends who are Cherokee, so I am one of the people who do know. So I'll introduce myself. And so what I just said is my name is Shanadine Bigay. I am Kintlechini, which is a Red House clan, and I am born for the Tango people, and that's my father's clan. And I can keep going, but that's probably good enough. But I wanted to do that because, to me, it's important that we have relationships between the Native tribes within this country. And it was so important to me that you said you acknowledge the people here, because I find that so important too. And one of the critical conversations I like to have is talking about, well, are you an American? Are you not American? And all these things. And as an indigenous person to this continent, it's a very different perspective. And I always find it important to give back to the people whose land I'm on and whose place I am taking and contributing to. And so I actively give back to the Native American community here, because that is my way of showing the nation-to-nation relationship that is so often ignored in this country. And one thing that I have noticed at Northeastern, I'm a postdoc here, is that there has been much more of inclusivity than some of the previous places I've been in Boston, and I find that very important. But one thing I noticed is in the language of even the email, they excluded Native American people. So I emailed right back and I said, look, you haven't included the Native American perspective. And so I think that that's an important thing that I always bring up, is just the words that we use even when we send out flyers or things have to include the Native experience as well, because it's so not included. And I also come from the STEM fields, and this STEAM idea, I would like to know more about that, because that's a new approach, and I just don't understand how that's come along and what have been the early results. So that was my question.
So, sure. So I think most people are probably aware of STEM, so science, technology, engineering, math, and then the A for STEAM would be arts. And so I come from an arts background. I worked in an arts organization, and I worked with a lot of other arts organizations in the networks that were looking for ways to change STEM to STEAM, because there are a lot of connections between the arts. So when you think about architecture, for example, it's not just about the numbers behind how to build something, how long, how tall, how much it weighs. It's also about the design, the beauty, the aesthetics of it. And so bringing in the arts as an example there, in terms of bringing the aesthetic of art and beauty into a scientific field.
Yeah, so you had tied economics to that, and that's a big part, I think, of what we all face as minority groups coming into something is the economic component. So does that drive the STEAM initiative over the STEM initiative? Or, because you had mentioned there was funding differences and this was maybe helping. So that was what I was wondering about also.
I didn't necessarily connect the two of them there. I was mentioning that in the article I saw in today's Globe, a lot of the nonprofits had managed to overcome some of the funding difficulties and some of the other difficulties they had because they were networking together. And later on I was saying that arts organizations in the city are looking to connect to Northeastern to change STEM to STEAM. So I wasn't making a direct connection between the article and that. But from most of what I've been hearing in terms of the arts organizations in Boston trying to push for STEAM, it's more on the education side versus the economic development side.
Okay, terrific. So we have a few minutes left. I think, yeah, I see you and I see you. So that's great. And so think, you know, if you have a question and it's bubbling, but it's not quite up there yet, sort of, you know, encourage it, get it up there, because we do have a few minutes left. And, you know, we want to actually make the most of this opportunity that we have for this conversation. People have come in from the cold to join us. And so we want to, you know, if you have ideas, if you have questions, if you have challenges, we will, you know, put them on the table so that we can hear them.
So I'm Brooke Baker. I'm from the law school, and I also went here. My dad actually went here. My dad graduated in '46, and I graduated from the law school in '76, and I've pretty much been around here ever since. And so I really appreciate what Christian had to offer, because to me, I experienced much more discord and unrest and disagreement and silencing than the kind of idealized community we would like to build. I actually see lots of ways in which it's not happening. So that's a point I'd like to make, but the question I'd like to ask is that my observation of our discussion has been that most of it is about how we interact with each other within the community in terms of listening and speaking and networking. And yet my sense of what a model community would be is one that's also active in the world and acknowledges what's going on in the world and has a mission of social justice, racial justice, economic justice, and overcoming the divisions that create the fractures and disconnects and difficulties within our community. And so I wonder if we've not been too introspective in this discussion and that we have not been as open to the world, both in how it's influencing the discord that does occur in our community, but also our response is not simply a discourse response within our community, a set of more polite interactions or more accepting interactions within our community, but actually tackling the structural violence and racism and other divisions that exist in the world. So that's a question, probably in the nature of a challenge, to whether we've been a little bit too internally focused in this discussion so far.
Thank you, Brooke. Why don't I take 2 or 3 of these, and then can you guys hold that? Hold the thought, hold the answer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dave. I'm a law school alumni. I hope the law school folks aren't dominating too much tonight. My question is that I've heard a lot tonight about what an ideal community looks like, and I love those thoughts. They were very valuable. The one thing I feel like I didn't hear a ton about is what the definition we're using for campus is, especially with regards to Northeastern, because one of the 2 ways you can read the idea of the program tonight is how do we make the campus of Northeastern sort of the best campus it can be? How can it be an ideal campus? But then how can it be an ideal model for communities other than campuses? And when I think about that, things I'm thinking of if we're talking about ideal communities being inclusive and tolerant and democratic is that there are people whose job it is on Northeastern's campus to tell who can and cannot be a member of this place. I sent money to this university so that I could then send much more money to this university. That's sort of like bottom line structural an issue about what a campus is. And so when we think about how we make it perfect, one of the things I keep having in my head running through there is the campus model something that can be a model for the rest of the world? Or does it have too many structural issues about inequality and hierarchy that don't make it a super great model for other places? Thank you.
Great question. Is there a third? And if there is, okay, there's two more, and then so. You guys?
Yep, we got it.
Going? Everybody awake? Okay, great.
Good evening. My name is Lynn, and I'm a visitor to your campus. It's my first time here, and I am extremely amazed because I have found this conversation to be so enriching, but also I have found it to be very safe. And I would like to use that safety to ask you a question. My question relates to listening. Listening is often a power play. It's often not an exercise for peace. My question to you is, how can we make it a lot easier to listen? And how can we recreate the action of listening so that it is a more natural habit that can be regularly practiced by model citizens? And if I may, I would like to contextualize this question in particular to refer to the current state of what I don't believe is Islamophobia anymore, but deep Islamo-paranoia. And I find that to be very violent towards Islam. So I would like to thank you for listening to my question, and perhaps, unless I were to tell you that my American accent is deceiving, because this is only my 4th time to the United States, I am actually a woman from and of the Arab world, and I look very forward to listening to your answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So those are 3 somewhat different questions. So let's get started. Darren?
Was Ellen ready?
Oh, I was so set.
Okay, go ahead.
I was so set, chomping at the bit. Thank you. I want to get back to a phrase that Delia used earlier, learning to unlearn, and how it is that when we learn to unlearn, we're actually changing the structures. And so we have to begin from ourselves, because our own dispositions are part and parcel of the systems and the structures that are based in Western imperialist thought. And here I'm evoking a decolonial understanding, and there's quite a few readings in this area that I would love to share with you if you're interested. But we have to start with ourselves as people who are part and parcel of these structures, and it is understanding that we are part of ecologies as well that have created these dispositions of inequality, of hierarchies of knowledge that would separate content from pedagogy, for example. That is a Western imperialist understanding of what a classroom should be, and it's not typical for other communities. It's also something that would continue to produce knowledge as a monetary endeavor, I think, and perpetuate that. I was trained in an open university, Cal State University, San Bernardino. Does anybody know what an open university is? It is a university that accepts everybody who applies. In that regard, it's very similar to the of inclusive community that a university might inspire to, but here, because this is a private university, I speak something that's probably very difficult and foreign for people to grasp, but it's something that I believe in very firmly, that we can make this accessible if we continue to work on our own dispositions. I want to talk to you wrap it up. about listening in particular and whether or not listening is just placating. I think in many cases it is, and that's where it becomes very dangerous. If somebody is looking at you and saying, I hear your pain, without necessarily engaging and creating that third space where you are learning to unlearn the systems and structures that have oppressed you. Thank you.
I just wanted to,
We had 3 questions.
yeah,
And I hope we all have them in mind.
yeah, yes, and I want to respond to the last question a little bit. I think one of the biggest challenges to listening is to be quiet, right? I think often, we are accustomed and encouraged to speak out and to talk, and I think sometimes we need to be quiet, because in being quiet, we are able to listen to other people and really hear them, and we are also able to make space for the people who aren't, visible, who aren't present, and I think more people need to be okay with being quiet. I really appreciated the questioning, this panel, what does it mean to be a model community, and are we starting in a place, that is a good foundation for a model community? And I think that's, a challenge that honestly, it's a question I ask myself every day. I think we have to accept the realities of that. We are all employees of Northeastern, we are paid by the institution, the students are paying money to the institution, and we accept that. But what can we do within the context, of that framework to, help our students unlearn and, be able to question, be able to be quiet, be able to listen to other people and understand their experiences.
So Ellen's comments about colonialism remind me of a comment that I said to the man who would eventually become my boss about 5 years ago when I was at a community meeting. And I turned to him when he said something, I said, that is so colonial. The way you're approaching the community is very colonial, and somehow I still got hired. But I say that because the university it's an institution. And this is going back to the second question. The university is an institution. It's an artificial construction. It's not an actual community in the way that neighborhoods and cities exist. So for us to think about the university functioning as a community the way actual communities do, I think is not necessarily impossible, but it won't actually function in the way that a normal community would. And I'm thinking specifically, so I work in city and community affairs, and so I'm thinking specifically about the way the university has interacted, it's evolving. The way it's interacted in the past with the neighborhoods is people from the university would say, oh, there's a problem out here, we're gonna go out and solve this problem. And it was always this idea of people moving from the university outwardly, and there was very little attempt to make the university porous so that people could move the other way around, and so the university would learn constantly from people who are not academics, who are not professors, who are not lawyers, but people who are just the common folks in the neighborhood, to learn from those people so that you had that experience and you had the opportunity to engage community and be community in a much more organic way. That, I think, is slowly evolving, but it's still going to take some time to change.
Derek, I really like that you said that it's really about kind of creating this permeable space. And I know the first time we met, you talked a lot about creating a third space, right? And the problem is, for me, is that when we're talking about listening, we don't talk about hearing. And for me, the most critical part of listening is hearing. How are you translating what I just told you into some actionable matter where you're reflecting your understanding of what you heard me say? Right? And that is not something that always happens, whether we're talking institutionally or we're talking interpersonally. And I think that's the biggest issue. Another issue I'd like to say, or thing I'd like to say, is that making sure that we are accounting and responsive to structural violence and social inequity is my fundamental understanding of what a healthy community is. Because otherwise, people can't speak, people can't contribute, and people can't really actually engage with each other and talk to each other, because by virtue of hierarchy, what people hear is not actually their truth, because it's so based on confirmation bias, which is closely associated with the media and other social norms, as Dove mentioned earlier.
I think that really pulls together the first and the second question, because as I understood the first question, it was whether or not the university has some obligation to deal with structural violence, racism, inequities, not only within the university, but those outside the university. The university is an institution that addresses the world's major problems, the major challenges that are currently facing the world, and the way in which they evidence themselves today. And so that reaches the whole question of structural violence that you were addressing. And then the second question, I think, was really about whether we're fooling ourselves by thinking that a university with its inherent hierarchies could ever be a model for anything. So I just wanted to pull both of those together just for a moment while we try to wrap all of this up. Doug, did you want to help us?
I don't know if I can wrap it all up, but I'll just try and, express my thoughts on a couple of the questions there. I think it's true that on the question of what is the role of the university, and indeed what is the role of faculty members in terms of promoting social justice activism in the world, on the one hand, I think that that part of what we're trying to do is about raising consciousness, and not only consciousness about the world's problems and our problems locally, but self-consciousness, the awareness of oneself and one's perspective. So in that sense, I think there's a very close connection between that kind of consciousness raising and the social justice activism that's talked about. At the same time, very on personal level, I'm ambivalent about that in terms of what I see my role as a professor, or what we should be trying to do here, because I think in a sense, and going back to what I talked about as critical inquiry, that can sometimes challenge the activist mode. So I think there's a tension there. On the one hand, we want students to interrogate multiple positions, to be able to develop empathy for different points of view, to be thinking about the structural roots of many of the issues. And at the same time, we're encouraging activism which can be in tension with these two things. And so I personally experience that. I kind of draw a separation myself between my role on campus and myself in the world. I think in a sense we're preparing students for a lifetime of engagement in the world, not just this little bubble of a few years. On the question of the community and what we can be, I think first of all, this is a highly exclusive community. It's one which we're all extremely privileged to be members of. I think one has to be aware of that. I think what comes for me, along with an awareness of that exclusivity and the privilege, is an obligation to then try to bring some of the values that we have internalized and developed in some of the social consciousness in our exclusive privileged community into the world. I think, no, we can't be a model for the wider society, but we can hold up an alternative, and we can make students aware that the community that they join afterwards is not necessarily, doesn't have to be the case, that it too is a constructed community, and so instead of taking that community for granted, I think we can be aware that that community can change, but I think it's a tall order to expect it to reflect the kind of community and discussion that we're having here today.
So we are going to wrap it up. We do have the dean here, actually. This has been an incredibly rich discussion, and a lot of stuff has been put on the table. And I'm not going to ask her to answer all of the issues that have been raised today, but I'm sure she has something to say about where we stand today with this conversation and where we ought to be headed. So thank you so much, Dean Poiger.
Thank you, Margaret, and I think we can really say a heartfelt thank you to all the panelists and to you as the audience for raising really important questions, both about our responsibilities on campus as well as about the responsibilities that we have as members of a campus beyond the campus, be it locally in Boston or in the much broader world. So I too agree. This has been an incredibly rich discussion. And before we all clap, I would just like to end with a very simple invitation to indeed continue to work on widening your networks. Perhaps you have a few more minutes to join us for a reception that we'll have right downstairs, outside here, right downstairs. If you have a few more minutes, take the time to meet someone of this community whom you have not met yet. Broaden your networks tonight, and let's all continue to think about these important issues in both spaces, small and big. We need to work on these in the classroom. We need to work on these issues as we think about a big strategic and academic plan for this university, and we need to think about these issues as we as students, staff, and faculty engage constantly with the world outside of Northeastern. So again, thank you so much for a most thoughtful and stimulating discussion.